Born John J. Jack Wilpers Jr., and that's an actual photo of the young lad back in the day. Evidently, they did that to kids with the haircuts. Born on November 11th, 1919. That was the first anniversary of the end of World War I. And Jack always liked to say that his birthday was a national holiday. His father was Jack Sr., mother was Helen McCormick. He had a sister, older sister, Helen, everybody called her Peggy. And he was born here in Albany. And this is some of his family. This is his mom right here, and some of her sisters and her mother. And so you see there's some Dolans and McCormicks and some Wilpers and no Wilpers yet. And Cicolela, how did he get in there? How did that happen? Here in Albany. Well, this looks like it was taken probably between 1900 and World War I. And that's right around the time the Irish and Italians were kind of getting together. It wasn't common before World War II, but it did happen. Don't I know it? My Italian-American grandfather from Brooklyn came upstate. He was a professional jazz musician. He played up the street here for, his band played for FDR and Al Smith. And he went to a party in Mechanicsville, met an Irish-American woman, and my father was born in 1931. So it did happen back then. And there was a book that came out just a few years ago called Unlikely Union, and it was about Irish and Italians intermingling and intermarrying during this period, but mostly it concentrated in New York City, and all the reasons why they did or didn't. It was really well done by a journalism professor who was an ex-Newsday reporter and editor, and he went into all this on how this stuff happened. So it did happen before World War II. What happened, I think, this is totally unscientific, all those GIs came back from World War II and basically said, you know, I almost got my butt shot off over there. I think I'm going to marry whoever I damn well please. And they did. But during this period, it was kind of frowned upon, but it did happen. So this is Jack Wilpers' family, and Jack, when Jack is 8 years old, his dad moved the family, they moved up to Wilton outside of Saratoga. Before that, Jack's father's family, his mother's was an Irish immigrant. Oh, and Mrs. Wilpers' parents were also Irish immigrants. Jack Sr. Worked for the family ice business here in Albany. And at one time, he also ran a gentleman's club across from the State House, AKA a speakeasy. Jack Sr. was a bookie, a bookmaker. When I finally did talk to Jack Jr., Jack Wilpers, and I was reading an account of 1945 of what he did, and the local papers always said, you know, the son of Mr. and Mrs. such and such, and Mrs. Wilpers ran a tea room outside at McGregor Golf Course, and Mr. Wilpers was a public accountant. And there was a pause at the end of the line, and Mr. Wilpers said, Jack Wilpers said, no, Dad was a bookie. Evidently in polite society, you didn't say that, but he didn't care. So they moved up to Wilton, and they lived at a house right next to McGregor Links, right at one of the holes, right at the turn, hole 9 or whatever. And there was a fence there, and Mrs. Wilpers and her daughter Peggy just started serving drinks and sandwiches to the golfers. And then they realized a lot of the golfers' wives had nothing to do while these guys are out. How long does it take to golf? 7, 8 days or something? I don't know, whatever golfers do, the wives needed something to do. So they started serving tea to the wives. So they had a tea house right there next to McGregor. But the house burned down. Nobody got hurt or anything. So then the Wilpers moved into Saratoga itself, lived at a couple different places in Saratoga, and eventually settled at an apartment on Broadway, right in the middle of Broadway right now, right where the old Adelphi is, and that bar at Druthers is right there. Jack Sr. runs a billiard hall right on Lake Avenue, right across from City Hall, right up the street from the Parting Glass. I'm sure some of you folks know where that is. It's right up the street. And one of the city directories listed him as an athletic promoter, whatever that was. The guy was a bookie at the track. That's why he moved north, to be at the track. And daughter Peggy opens a women's clothing shop on Broadway, and she was there for a lot of years. That would be Jack's sister Peggy. Jack went to Saratoga schools and went to what was then called St. Peter's Academy, now known as Spa Catholic, right in downtown Saratoga. And during the summers, and Jack was always, he was a depression kid in Saratoga. And I've heard this from so many people in Saratoga of a certain age. Everybody had to hustle. Everybody had to make a buck. It was a depression. Nobody had any money, including Jack Wilpers. He would do anything to make a buck. And he learned to play pool at his dad's pool hall. He did not want to play Jack Jr. at pool for money. He got real good at pool. And in the summers, when he was in high school and then in college also, he worked at one of the casinos, the old lake houses around Saratoga Lake. And he worked at one of the bigger and more better known ones was the Arrowhead. And these were all run by mobsters. Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel. They all ran these places during the track season. They were only open during the track season. These were the original casinos, really, Las Vegas style casinos, where you had a floor show out front and gambling out in the back, kind of like the opening scene in Casablanca. The entertainment's out front, tables, boom, and you wanted to gamble, you went out back. And Jack was a waiter there. There's a picture of him, opening the door for, don't know who she is, dressed in his waiter's uniform. And so Jack would work there, and one of the stories his family told me is, since his family lived in downtown Saratoga, the lake houses were a few miles away out by the lake. So at the end of the night, he would hitch a ride back with basically the bagmen, the mobsters' bagmen, with that night's take of the casino. Heavily armed bagmen. They had to drop it off at the guy. There were two guys in Saratoga who ran the graft. One was a Republican named Leary. The other one was an Italian-American guy named Ferrone. Ferrone lived near the track. And so they would have to drop off that take at Ferrone's house. So Jack would just hitch a ride, basically, with these guys, armed to the teeth. So it was probably the safest ride he was going to get. So Jack did that for several years. Then he went off to college, St. Michael's College, University of Toronto. He graduated from St. Peter's in '37. He wanted to be a lawyer. So he went up there and graduated in June 1942. Before that, his first cousin and best friend was Johnny Cicolello from Albany. And as a lot of first cousins, he grew up just, partners in crime, best friend. And at one point when Jack was in college, they wanted to go see a Notre Dame game. Jack was a Notre Dame Fighting Irish fan, of course. And they hitchhiked. He must have met Johnny somewhere along the way. They hitchhiked to South Bend to see Notre Dame play. And they get there, there's no game. Notre Dame was playing on the road. Which, before the internet and all this technology, who knew? Who knew? You got a little trouble with that, I guess, at the university, because you weren't supposed to just go AWOL for a whole lot of time. But he did graduate in 1942, and of course by then the war has started, or the United States is now in the war. We're 6 months into the war. In June 1940, it might have been this week that he graduated, June 42. And also, I'll interject a little plug here for myself and the Associated Press. I've got a story coming out this weekend on the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Midway, which is 75th anniversary is Sunday. Anybody ever heard of Wade McCluskey? Wade McCluskey was an Irish guy from South Buffalo, the old Irish neighborhood. He was a dive bomber pilot on the USS Enterprise, and he did a couple of really great things at Midway that pretty much saved us during that war. And that also happened 75 years ago this weekend. So look for it in Sunday's papers or online. Wade McCluskey. I can tell you more about that afterwards. So he goes into the Army on August 26, 1942. They shut down the track during the war. I forgot which years, but I like to think that the track was still going on, and Jack waited till the last day of the track to go in the Army, because he was always around the track. When he helped his father with his running bets at the track, and he loved horses. Jack had his own horse as a kid. He had a pony. So he's private John J. Wilpers. He's trained as a weather observer at an airfield in Illinois. And then he gets sent down to Texas. And when he's in Texas, he meets a couple down there that has horses. And he offers to take care of their horses. and ride their horses. So the family has pictures of the dad on a horse in Texas. And also down there in Texas, around the same base, was his cousin from Albany, Johnny Cicolella. But Johnny was already a lieutenant, and Jack was still an enlisted man. And you weren't really supposed to hang out together, whatever, but Johnny arranged to get a lieutenant's uniform to Jack so they could go out together and bar hop. And keep that whole uniform thing in mind because it keeps popping up with these guys. He gets accepted at OCS, Officers Candidates School, down in North Carolina, passes that, becomes a second lieutenant in the United States Army. He's initially signed to a coastal artillery battalion out here on Cape Cod. And then he's shipped across country, he trains across country. And then on August 26th, he's shipping out. 2 years to the day that he entered the Army. He got into what was known as the Counterintelligence Corps, the CIC. The Army and the Navy had their own intelligence apparatus. But by that time, speaking of 75-year anniversaries, in June of 1942, FDR signs an order creating the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. That anniversary is coming up, I think, next week or in a couple weeks. And that became our overall intelligence agency. And the guy that FDR assigned to basically form that, found it, and build it from scratch was a guy named Bill Donovan. General William Wild Bill Donovan from South Buffalo, another Irishman. And what Donovan did was recruit college athletes, Olympic athletes, college professors, people that spoke multiple languages, scientists, anybody that could just help build this network of intelligence people that we needed for the Pacific and Europe. And it was pretty amazing what he did, how he did this. And there were 13,000 people in the OSS at its height, and they did everything. Today's Navy SEALs, Green Berets, and all these special ops all trace their lineage to their beginnings to the OSS. And Donovan was always coming up with ideas. Some of them were pretty wacky. I had the opportunity to interview a couple of the OSS veterans that are still alive. There's not many, maybe there's 100 out of the 13,000. One of them was a guy named Frank Monteleone. I think he's still alive in New York City, Italian-American from Brooklyn. Since he spoke Italian, they sent him to Italy. He was in the maritime unit and one of the original frogmen. And then and since he was also a radio operator, they would send him behind enemy lines to do spy work. And one of the spies he was teamed up was with a guy named Mo Berg. Any baseball fans out there? Mo Berg was a major league player in the 20s and 30s who did barnstorming with Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig in places like Japan. And somebody in the U.S. military said, hey, while you're over there, take some pictures, write down some stuff. So he was a spy, Mo Berg. So this guy, Frank, was teamed up with Mo Berg. The other guy I interviewed was an agent dropped behind enemy lines in France. And they had told him, if you're getting in trouble, seek out this Italian priest who's running this parish, Catholic parish in France. Because this priest is helping Jews escape, he's helping down to Allied airmen escape, he's helping the underground. Seek him out. So sure enough, this guy gets in trouble. He seeks out this Italian priest who hides him from the Nazis, who are literally hot on his back. Hides him, whatever, the guy survives. That priest later becomes Pope John. Things you learn as an AP reporter. So anyway, sidetrack here with the OSS. But Jack is in the CIC. They arrive at Oro Bay, New Guinea. And that's about a year. General MacArthur had started the New Guinea campaign about a year earlier, so that was winding down. New Guinea's on this end of the island. Port Moresby, Oro Bay would have been like over here. And New Guinea, by the way, that was just all jungle, and it was just a horrific campaign for everybody involved. To this day, New Guinea is the world's largest airplane graveyard. There's thousands of planes from that war back there, stuck there, and just will never be found. But there's actually people that go out there and find these things. And you can check that out online. So anyway, Jack is there, and the CIC decide they have to teach the guys some of the languages of the places they're going to be going, like the Philippines. So they send Jack and a bunch of his buddies to Australia. As you know, Australia was settled by convicts mostly, British convicts, who happen to be all Irish, or most of them. Irish convicts, Irish rebels. And the Irish love horses, so they love horse racing. So the Irish started racetracks. And doesn't Jack Wilpers, Irish American from Albany and Saratoga, doesn't he find one of the racetracks? And sure enough, he hit the local racetrack. I did manage to pay my respects and probably my dues. And so while he's there, he's learning the Filipino language, Tagalog. So, because the next campaign is going to be the Philippines. That's what MacArthur's aiming for. So, on the way to the Philippines, they stop at a place called Peleliu. Peleliu was in the Palau Islands, and the Marines had captured it and had invaded it in September of '44. And it took them about a month to end this battle. As usual, the Japanese fought to the last man. And Peleliu was just a coral speck in the middle of nowhere. And what the Japanese had done was dug these caves in the side of these hills, these coral hills, and laid rails, and then put guns on the rails so they'd go in and out, shoot at an American position or a ship, bring them back in, and we couldn't bomb, we couldn't get to them. Airplanes couldn't get to them. So the Marines had to go cave by cave, and this took about a month. And that was the 1st Marine Division. The 1st Marine Division was at Guadalcanal, Peleliu, and Okinawa. And the guys that survived all three, or the second two, said Peleliu was the worst. And nobody's heard of it. You've heard of Okinawa, probably Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima. Peleliu, these guys said it was the worst. It was near the equator, so it was over 100 degrees every day. When the Navy sent in water in these big 55-gallon drums, turns out there had been fuel in the tanks. They didn't clean them out properly, so the water was undrinkable. So guys were passing out. Guys were dying of hydration, and so it was just horrible for these guys. So on the way there, on the way to Philippines, Jack's unit lands on Peleliu, and he gets by the way, that looks like sand or even snow. It's not. What the Navy would do is bring in the Seabees, the construction battalions, with these big crushing machines. So they would dig up all this coral, crush it, lay it down, bring rollers in, and that's how they would make or repair airfields. So Jack did stop there briefly, and he and his buddies toured the island. A few years before he died, he put together this book from all his wartime photos and letters, and that's the cover of the book. That's a cover photo of the book. And in the book, he said, in the Peleliu part, he said, "I can't believe they fought so hard, that the Japanese, for this speck of coral. How are they going to fight for their own homeland?" And that was pretty much the mindset of all these GIs as they're heading to Japan, knowing that the invasion of Japan is just going to be horrific. Right around that time, MacArthur lands our forces on Leyte, island Leyte in the Philippines, so that campaign starts. And Jack is a member of a CIC unit. His job is going to be to gather any intelligence he can on the Japanese and the Philippines. Their armament, what weapons are used in their positions, their interaction with anything that would help the combat troops. That's what the CIC guys do. CIC guys weren't combat troops themselves, though they were often right behind the first or second wave. And some of them did see combat and some were killed. Jack himself said in one of his letters he didn't see much combat, but the pictures I saw, he went around armed with a carbine and a sidearm, because in the Philippines, as they were advancing, there were a lot of Japanese hanging around the back lines, doing sneak attacks. So they were always, and Jack would have seen the aftermath of battles. So he saw a lot of pretty hairy stuff. And one thing he had to do was track down collaborators, Filipino collaborators that had worked with the Japanese, and also track down Japanese. Japanese had their own version of secret police, who were pretty nasty to the Filipinos. So that was one of Jack's jobs. And I guess he said when they found collaborators, and the thing they had to do was hand them over to the local Filipinos, and that usually didn't end well for the collaborators. That's a map of the Philippines that I found at the last minute. I must have thought I was like Ken Burns. I don't know why I threw that up there, because you can't really read anything. But anyway, MacArthur came in here, and these guys did that, whatever. But Jack was there for a lot of months, and he saw a good chunk of the Philippines. And he learned the language to the extent of, in his older years, when he was ever in the hospital around he moved to the Washington, D.C. area, which evidently has a lot of Filipino immigrants who were nurses. He would speak to them in their language. He would sing he remembered the words to old folk songs, would bring these women to tears. And then word got around, hey, go up to room whatever, 2-something. The old soldier up there singing our songs. And so that was an indication of what kind of guy he was. So Jack is in the Philippines when the first atomic bomb is dropped, and the second, August 6th and August 9th. And then, so everybody in the Pacific, Americans, everybody's going to Japan now. It's not going to be an invasion, it's going to be an occupation. Along the way, he stops briefly on Okinawa. And from there, Jack is right behind the first troops. I think it's August 28th. The surrender was, Japanese announced their surrender August 15th, and by August 28th, Americans were landing in transport planes on Japan itself. And ships are starting to land. So that's around August 28th. And Jack was there pretty early. That's his unit in the Philippines. You can see there's a couple of Filipino guys they worked with as interpreters. There's Jack right in the middle. The actual surrender ceremony was on the USS Missouri on September 2nd. A day earlier, Jack was at a hotel in Yokohama. Tokyo is at the top of Tokyo Bay, and Yokohama's farther south. And there was a hotel that hadn't been bombed to hell. That was a headquarters, and Jack was hanging around there. And so he writes a letter to his mom. This is better than his 3-ring circus, because who he saw there was everybody and anybody that was going to be on this surrender, at the surrender the next day. I don't know if you've seen any of those newsreels, where all these officers, well, Nimitz and Halsey, and everybody, MacArthur himself, he just listed all the people he saw, all these famous generals, all these admirals. Jack was around that. He didn't actually go to the surrender ceremony, but he saw all these famous people, including General Percival, who was a British general at Singapore when they surrendered, and General Wainwright, who was the American general who was in charge of the American troops when they surrendered the Philippines. And I'm trying to think some of the other names, but just anybody, the people at that time would know these guys were making headlines. So the surrender ceremony is held on the Missouri, and if you've seen those newsreels, the ship is packed. Probably between the sailors that run the ship, the dignitaries, all the officers, all whoever, probably 2,000 people there. Not one woman. There was not one woman, reporter or otherwise, on that ship. There should have been, and that person should have been an Associated Press reporter. The AP had 18 people they were sending to cover the ceremony, reporters and photographers. And there wound up being 16 on the actual ship for the ceremony. One of the ones, guys that didn't make it was interviewing POWs who were being released. Now the war's been over for 2 weeks or so, but they're still finding American and Allied POWs all over the Japanese Empire, including Japan itself. It's taken a while for these guys to come in and get them in, and so the one guy was interviewing them, and a woman reporter for the AP who was going to be assigned to the surrender, but she got busy interviewing POWs. So she would have been the only woman there, but she wasn't, she couldn't make it. The guy that was in charge of the photos, the photographers for the AP, was a guy named Max Desforce, who went all across the Pacific, and after the war, he stayed over there for the AP. And so when the Korean War started, they sent him to Korea. And Max was right in the front lines, right from the beginning. And he wound up getting a Pulitzer Prize in 1951 for his photos. One of them is a famous photo of Japanese, Korean refugees crawling over the girders of a bridge that had been blown up. And there was like thousands of people. It's a famous photo. Last I heard, Max is still living in Alexandria, Virginia. He's 106. So Max is still around. So he was the head photographer at that day. So anyway, they surrender on the 9th. And on September 10th, the night of September 10th, the head of Jack's CIC units, the Army CIC units, gets called in and says, hey, General MacArthur wants you to go get Tojo tomorrow. So on September 11th, MacArthur sends out a press release announcing that They want to arrest the high-ranking Japanese military and civilian leaders. And a guy named Hideki Tojo, the former Japanese prime minister, is #1 on the hit list. They want him. So Jack is a part of a 5-man CIC unit. There's a major in charge. And they're giving the orders, go get Tojo. So who is Tojo? He was born in Tokyo in 1884. Nickname was the Razor, or Razorhead, or Razor Brain. Evidently, he was just a very sharp and precise person. So the Japanese, this is an American nickname, the Japanese named him the Razor. And his father was an army general in Japan in the late 1800s. Graduated from their version of West Point. He served as an officer in China when the Japanese were just cream in China in the 1930s. Became army minister, and then he became prime minister of Japan in October 1941. When America got in the war, everybody thought Tojo came up with the Pearl Harbor plan. He didn't. That was already in the works. It was a Admiral Yamamoto who came up with the plan for bombing Pearl Harbor. All Tojo did was sign off on it. He basically said, "Yep, okay, go for it." And he stayed as prime minister all through the war, including during the capture of the Philippines, during the Bataan Death March, during all of the campaigns across the Pacific. And then he resigned, basically got fired in July 1944. What happened was we invaded Saipan. Saipan was only about 1,500 miles from Tokyo. There was 2 Marine divisions in the Army's 27th Division. That was the first time in the Pacific where they combined Marines and Army, and it didn't really go well. The 27th Division was a New York National Guard unit that got federalized, basically got called up right before Pearl Harbor. And these guys were over in the Pacific for 4 years, almost right away. A lot of them were from here, from our area, from Albany, Troy, Schenectady. And the one thing you can look at, the old rosters, is their names. The makeup of these different companies from different regiments, from different parts, kind of followed our ethnic makeup of our towns and mill towns. The Irish guys were from Albany. The Italian guys tended to be from Troy. The French-Canadian guys were from Tojos. Polish guys from Schenectady and Amsterdam. And they pretty much stayed together to the point where they got, and then there was a big influx of downstate guys from New York City, right before they went overseas. So by the time they got to Saipan, there were a lot of New Yorkers, a lot of New York guys at Saipan. And right towards the end of the Battle of Saipan, doesn't the 27th Division's 105th Regiment, which again was heavy with New York guys from our area, they get hit with the biggest banzai charge of the entire Pacific. Banzai was at the end when the Japanese had no hope, and they just said banzai and they rushed you. Well, there were thousands of Japanese rushing at less than 1,000 Americans, and they almost got wiped out. And I've done stories on those guys over the years, and most of them are all dead. But there were a whole lot of guys from this area who survived that, and a whole lot of other ones that didn't. 2 of them got the Medal of Honor, posthumous Medal of Honor, and both were from Troy. A Captain O'Brien and a Sergeant Baker. And so I got to talk, like I said, I got to talk to some of these guys that survived that. And it became kind of ironic that New York guys had a key role in Tojo losing his job, considering what would happen in another year or so, thanks to a New York guy. And by the way, they have a display of these guys of the 27th Division at the Military Museum in Saratoga Springs. And down in the basement is the library, and they have a lot of the 27th Division's records. And they're always doing research and stuff on these guys. And I just don't think a lot of people in our area know about what these guys went through. It was just amazing. I mean, we know about the Marines and Iwo Jima, we know about, the guys at Normandy, but what these guys went through at Saipan is pretty amazing. Tojo was the villain during World War II as far as the Pacific War. There were thousands of propaganda posters produced during the war, hundreds of them depicting Tojo. This is one of the nicer ones. Usually he's depicted, or a caricature or a resemblance of him with sharpened teeth, with blood dripping, and he was enemy number one. Everybody that image of him, his bald head, glasses, to a lot of people he was stereotypical Japanese, which, our forces found out that wasn't true. They didn't have bad eyesight. They weren't tiny. In fact, the guys from the 27th, the first place they ran into the Japanese was Macon Island. And they all said, 2 or 3 guys said, I came across a dead Japanese. He was like 6 foot something. They found out later that was the Japanese Imperial Marines. You couldn't be an Imperial Marine unless you were at least 6 foot. So that whole stereotypical stuff, our guys learned in a hurry that, no, that's not true. Another example of the propaganda that they would put out. When you look at some of the posters that they would put out, sometimes they throw in Hermann Goering or Himmler, or on the Japanese side, Emperor Hirohito. And I think they realized after a while, it's just easier to have three images, 3 guys up there. So they always threw Tojo in there. But Tojo, unlike Mussolini and Hitler, Tojo wasn't a dictator. Tojo was a prime minister. There was a command structure in the military, there was a cabinet, and of course everybody answered to the emperor. But it was just easy to throw, I think, to get the message across, this is the enemy. This is the guy you want. This is the guy that's causing all this. And just saw on TV the Sullivans movie about the Sullivan brothers. And at one point, the brothers have gone off to war, and they send back a letter. And one of the women is reading the letter in the kitchen to the father, Thomas Mitchell, who played Tara's father, Irish father, in Gone with the Wind. Thomas Mitchell, saying, "Dad, everything's well, and we hope to soon to be in Tokyo to spit in Tojo's eye." So everybody back then knew who Tojo was, and we didn't get Mussolini, we didn't get Hitler as far as putting him on trial. Mussolini was executed by the Italian partisans April 28th, 1945, outside of Milan, and then they hung him up by his heels outside a gas station. There's a famous photo of that. There was an AP reporter covering the war then, George Bria, who was born in Italy, moved to New York with moved to Connecticut with his parents, grew up in America, got a job with the AP. The AP sent George Bria to Italy when we invaded Italy. So George Bria followed the U.S. Army all up the boot of Italy, right up to northern Italy, and then he got word that that Mussolini had been shot. So George Bria goes over to Milan, and they just cut down Mussolini's body, and there's the Italian leader of the guerrillas who shot him. And he was telling George Bria, he goes, "I wanted to shoot Tojo. I didn't want to shoot his mistress." No, evidently the mistress of Mussolini threw herself in front of Mussolini, and she got shot too, and they hung her up too. George Bria died the day after St. Patrick's Day down in Westchester, and he was 101. So evidently the key to a long life is to be a war correspondent for the Associated Press. So anyway, we didn't, Tojo, Mussolini's gone. 2 days after Mussolini's killed, Hitler commits suicide in his bunker. And he would have heard about and even seen pictures, because the pictures of Mussolini hanging from this gas station went out on the wire services. And the stories went out. And Hitler certainly would have heard about it. And evidently that's why his orders were, when I commit suicide, cremate my body and Eva Braun's body, which they did. Keep that in mind, because 5 months later, Tojo himself, he knows what happened to Mussolini, what they did to his body, and they know. Oh, and there was also an issue after Hitler committed suicide, conspiracy theories to this day. Was that really Hitler's body? Did he really, you know what I mean? Because you couldn't recognize him. So anyway, keep that in mind, because Tojo certainly did. On September 10th, 1945, 2 reporters from the Associated Press, Merlin Spencer and Russell Brines, went to Tojo's house. Evidently, he was in the phone book. These guys found out where he lived. These 2 reporters sat down with him, and there's Tojo in the back of his house. Tojo's gardener was working on the garden. There's Tojo just hanging out, and they came up and said, "Can we talk to you?" And he said, "Sure." So these 2 AP reporters got a huge exclusive, big scoop, and that went all over the world. Merlin Spencer, by the way, had been in the Philippines when the war started and got captured and was interred along with other civilians. So he was a guest of the emperor, as they said. So That's just that's one account of Evansville Courier. That's out of Indiana. Evidently, Japanese officers and leaders were committing suicide all over the place. A lot of their soldiers did anyway, on the battlefield or off the battlefield. But once the surrender happened, Japanese were just killing themselves left and right. The shame of losing, except for Tojo. So people were actually calling his house. I guess he must have been listed in the phone book. And people would say, and his wife would answer, and people would say, has he killed himself yet? Is he dead yet? They were so pissed at Tojo and what happened in Japan. Why isn't he dead yet? I think it's in there, one of these stories. They were just so ticked off that he hadn't committed suicide like all these other leaders, all these other officers. So Jack's unit is sent to Tojo's house on September 11th, 1945. And by the time they get there late afternoon. By the time they're there, the AP guys had been there the day before. So now all the other media, they weren't called media, all the other press wants to get at Tojo. They want to get their own stories. So Jack Wilpers himself said, we kind of knew where he was, but why not just follow the press guys? They already know where he is. And once they get there, all the press is mingling around the house. Tojo won't come out. And Jack's commanding officer, a major, says, send Tojo out. I'm here to take him in custody by authority of General MacArthur. And then at one point, Tojo sticks his head out twice. And a Yank magazine was an Army publication during the war that went all over the world. And a guy named George Burns, who's actually from Albany, he was an Albany Times Union photographer. He winds up working for Yank magazine. He snaps this picture, and then some smart ass in the press or the media outside says, this is beginning to look like a Romeo and Juliet battle, let me see. And still, Tojo's not coming out. And this Major Krause, Jack's commanding officer, he's getting ticked off. He basically says, knock it off. Come on out. Let's go. Let's get this over with. Well, then they hear a gunshot from inside. So Krause and Jack Wilpers bust through a front door, and then they come to an interior door. And Jack kicks it in. When he kicks it in, Tojo is still standing up, smoke's coming out of a gun, he's starting to bleed from his chest, and Krause says, don't shoot, and then Tojo basically collapses in a chair. And George Burns, and meanwhile, all the press guys, press guys are piling in behind him, including George Burns. And he snapped this picture, and this picture went everywhere. This is a pretty famous picture. You'll notice in the back, that's a samurai sword, and then a shorter sword. That's Japanese, the shorter sword they'd use to cut themselves in the belly, commit suicide. And there's Jack picking up Tojo's gun, and you can see he's just started to bleed. And Tojo wore a white shirt, white blouse, riding pants, jodhpurs, because he was an cavalry officer. And what he said was he didn't shoot himself in the head because he wanted everybody to recognize him. Remember the Hitler thing, where they didn't know for sure if that was about Tojo wanted everybody to know this was Tojo. And he also wrote, there's another picture, there were Associated Press photographer who was there with the Associated Press guys. They had moved Tojo to a small couch, and this guy, Charles Gory, had been all across the Pacific for the AP. He was at Iwo Jima, and he would have been with Joe Rosenthal. Joe Rosenthal took the famous flag-raising picture for the Associated Press. Charlie Gory was there. Charlie was at Okinawa. Charlie was on the USS Intrepid, which is now a floating museum down in Manhattan. He was on the Intrepid off Okinawa, and that's when all the kamikazes were hitting. And Intrepid got hit bad, and Charlie helped rescue some sailors and help battle the fires, and the Navy thought so highly of him, they gave him a medal, gave him a bronze medal. And this is something Jack told me eventually. We managed it practically at gunpoint to get a next door neighbor to get a doctor, and he was forced to come down and treat me. Tojo wanted to kill himself. So the Japanese that were there, Tojo's aides, a couple of their aides, his aides were there. They were like, no, let him die. He wants to die. And Jack Wilpers basically said, to hell with that. No, he's not dying on my watch. And Jack still had his gun out, basically. He was kind of like, somebody do something now. So they got this doctor to come down, this old Japanese doctor who lived nearby. And he just was like, said the same thing. No, he's gonna die anyway, just let him die. And that's when Jack said, no, treat him now. So the Japanese doctor just did the minimum. That's another picture, again, another Charles Gory photo. The guy behind here with the glasses is Merlin Spencer, the guy that was a prisoner in the Japanese and that got the exclusive interview. And you can see the look on his face. He's like, you can die any time now, bastard. Which was pretty much the attitude of all the press guys in there, because a lot of the press guys, most of the press guys, some of them had just been reassigned from Europe. The war in Europe had ended, so they got sent over there. But a lot of these guys had been covering the war in the Pacific from day one. And they saw a lot of the aftermath. They were on the front lines. They just saw the stuff that the Japanese did. There was no love lost for these guys watching Tojo bleed, which they thought was he was bleeding to death. And so when they all got in there, these being mostly American reporters, they started grabbing stuff. Just like the soldiers, everybody likes souvenirs. So all these reporters, anything, they're grabbing everything they can. Lighters, ashtrays, anything they can off the desk. And here's Jack Wilpers, his job was grab any papers, grab any something. So he's like grabbing stuff out of the hands of all these reporters. And these reporters are rushing in, the photographers are rushing in, and Tojo's going into shock. So you see his eyes are closing. Photographers started yelling at him, Tojo, hey Tojo. And he would snap his eyes open, and they'd snap a picture. So he wanted a picture with his eyes open. I know there's a lot of people don't think highly of the media these days. We're all Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts compared to what these guys were doing that day. One of the reporters took a penknife, and evidently when he shot himself, it went out his shoulder, and the bullet lodged in one of the chairs. And this reporter dug it out and took it as a souvenir. So the samurai swords, that George Burns guy, photographer, he got caught sticking one of them down his pant leg. And one of the accounts said, an MP said, no, you don't. I think it was Jack Wilpers that said, no, you don't. That comes back. So you got George Burns got a little trouble for that. That's the front of Tojo's house. The whole thing was a cross between the Marx Brothers movie Hell's A-Poppin' and An Irish Way. Hell's A-Poppin' was a madcap comedy Broadway show that got made into a movie in the late 30s or 40s. And you might recognize that name, Cornelius Ryan, who wrote the... And he's describing the scene in that room. And this went on for a while. Oh, also, there was only one phone in the house. And back then, the reporters all had to get to a phone. One guy realized that. I don't know which one. He ran to a phone, and he got it, and all the rest of the reporters were like, damn it. So once the news guys got into Tokyo after the surrender, they set up their bureaus and hotels and such. So this guy got on the phone and called back to the desk and said, Tojo shot himself. Boom, flash, boom, they started. I know it was an AP guy, got the phone first, but then they took turns calling into the news. Tojo shot himself, he's dying, bleeding to death. So they'd take turns and they would just keep going back, and they'd get on the phone, and the editor at the other end, is he dead yet? Is he dead yet? No, he's still hanging on. This went on for a couple hours because they're waiting for a doctor. Oh, by the way, by then, whether it was Jack or Major Krause, they put out word, we need an American doctor here. We need American medical team. And that's one of the doctors treating him right there. And I think his name was Johnson. He was from Ohio. He was the first doctor on the scene. And even that turned into kind of like a Marx Brothers thing, because when they got the word to go to Tojo's house, this medical team had to find enough gas for their vehicle to get there. And the medical team at that time was just 2 doctors, 2 officers, and the rules were an officer can't drive a Jeep or an ambulance. You have to find an enlisted man. So then they had to find a sergeant to drive them there, so it took a while. But he got there, and his doctor patched them up and started putting plasma in them. And this is one of the stories, one of the headlines, one of the papers, and it's the Saratoga, Jack's hometown newspaper. This is something important. It's Associated Press. Wilpers calls doctor for Tojo, plasma. So Jack Wilpers is making headlines all over the world. This is the Albany Times Union. This was an inside page. That's what we call a jump page or whatever, but you see they did their own little sidebar because they had an Albany connection. Papers would do that. And yeah, the doctor is apathetic as ex-premier's life ebbs. That would be the Japanese doctor, not the American doctor. And this was part of that Times Union little sidebar. And they would always mention, you know, like I said, the parents of and where they lived, and his aunts were still living here in Albany, in the streets where they lived. And one of the aunts said he wanted to be a lawyer. Greatest ambition was to be a lawyer. Oh, and the Sequelellas, and I didn't know this until I found this in that Times Union. They had 4 sons in the service, 3 in the Pacific, including Jack's good buddy Johnny. That's another example of one of the headlines. And at that time, the Associated Press had 1,500 newspapers that got the AP service at that time. 1,500 just in the United States, plus hundreds of other radio stations, not counting overseas papers. So the AP was one of the biggest news providers at that time. So Jack Wilpers was making headlines. Just about every paper in the country would have printed this. You'll see down here, Tojo known as Razor Blade. Seattle, just to give you an idea, all across the country, Seattle Times, Marana. Little interesting thing here. This headline refers to, I mentioned Yamamoto, the guy that planned the Pearl Harbor attack. Because we had broken the Japanese naval code, we knew where Yamamoto was going. And we knew he was flying somewhere over in the Pacific in the Solomon Islands around Guadalcanal. So they sent some American fighter planes to shoot him down. And they got him. April, I think, 1943. Well, here it is 2 years later, more than 2 years later, the military finally released details of what happened. They had announced it earlier, but they didn't put any details. They didn't want anybody to know we had broken their code. So it wasn't until right around this time that Tojo tried to kill himself that they started releasing details of that mission, how they tracked Yamamoto and shot him down and he died. And so in this guy here, MacArthur orders Homa. Homa was the Japanese general in charge of the invasion of the Philippines. So he was in charge when the Bataan Death March happened. So there's another guy we really wanted to get. This is a Utah paper, so it's the same thing, you know. Oh yeah, here's the MacArthur orders 39 persons arrested, Tojo being one of them. And again, Yamamoto shot down story is there. Yeah, Jack was making headlines. This is Yank magazine. George Burns photographer. His story is in here. My brother Don was able to find some of these online, so we got a few copies of this. Yank magazine, since the Army was all over the world, they had different editions all over the world. And this is the Germany edition after the war in Europe ended October 19th. So they reprinted stuff from the different war theaters. And just to give you an idea what it looked like in Yank magazine, there's that famous picture. This is George Burns' article. Some more of his pictures. And something what he wrote. It just sounds like something out of a 1940s war movie, doesn't it? You want to eat that, or you want to go see Tojo arrested? And the guy that said that, Clark Lee, started out the war as an AP correspondent. He was one of our stars, and he got hired away by something called INS, International News Service. This is more of George Burns', I don't think he was related to the old actor comedian, more his description of what happened. Jack Wilpers told me that this George Burns guy was right behind him when he went in. And I came across accounts of this from the New York Times, where the New York Times reporter claims that he was the first reporter in the room. And it was really a I did this, first person, but that's the New York Times. That's what they do. Anyway, and like the small divan thing had been pushed up into the door, and yeah, just more accounts of that thing. And the Times Union reprinted that whole Yank magazine article probably a week or so after that came out because of the Jack Wilpers connection. And that's Tojo, in his uniform with all his medals. And notice the collar tabs, there's 3 stars. So, and then I mentioned that book Jack Wilpers produced for his kids before he died. And it had a bunch of pictures and wartime letters and photos from overseas, and including this picture. You can see that. It says, in Tojo's coat. That's Jack Wilpers, evidently in Tojo's coat. So I thought, when I went online, I found all sorts of pictures of Tojo in his uniform. I could probably find that exact coat, but I couldn't find it. I just couldn't. But then, in all the Associated Press archive people and corporate archive people in New York helped me with all these old articles you're seeing by the AP. They sent me a bunch. And after I was trying to find this Tojo in this coat, I was like, damn, well, how can I confirm this? And then I noticed, this thing caught my eye, this in boldface, we call a subhead, 6 rows of decorations. Tojo had prepared for the occasion, meaning his suicide, by putting on a general's green uniform with 3 gold stars, complete with 6 rows of decorations. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Because of the heat of the afternoon, in September, it's still summer in Japan, and evidently Japan's very humid in the summer. So because of the heat, he took off the tunic, and then he put neatly on a straight back chair against the wall. A military sword leaned against the chair, 2 other swords rested on deer's antlers setting on the library table. I pointed out that stuff. So I think this is really Jack Wilpers. Don't you love him though? He's just doing this. Probably could have gotten in trouble for this. And when I did this same talk at the Military Museum in Saratoga on April 1st, afterwards a woman said, what happened to that? And the Wilpers don't have it. He didn't bring it home as a souvenir. I said, I don't know, but I'm going to find out. So what I did was send an email to the United States Army Museum people in Washington. They have museums all over the place. West Point Museum is one of theirs. And I told them what I was looking for. And just yesterday, the guy got back to me. He says, we don't have it. But our curators were real interested and real surprised to see this. So, and what I did today was, and I'm going to show you here. Still trying to find this. And this was just a magazine article, came out a couple of years ago. It kind of sums it up. Somebody had to hang for the Pacific War, and it was going to be this guy. This article actually used some of my information from some of my story, but and he did. We did put Tojo on trial, war crimes. Took a couple of years, and he was convicted, and he was hung on around midnight on December 30th in Tokyo, at a prison. December 30th, 1948. A week shy of his 64th birthday. And he was cremated and his ashes were scattered like out to sea. But there's still some people that think some Japanese managed to get some of his ashes and put them in the Japanese war memorial shrine in Tokyo. And that's still controversial because when the Japanese Prime Minister goes there to pay respects to the war dead, a lot of the war dead were war criminals who did horrible things in Korea and China and the Philippines, and not just to Americans. So that's still with us. That controversy is still with us. Other people say no, that didn't happen. The ashes just all got. And Jack Wilpers himself said, no, all the ashes got scattered out to sea. Nobody got them. That's Tojo's one of his granddaughters. She ran for office in Japan in the late 90s, and she was a nationalist, a rightist. She's holding up a picture of him in a different uniform, and he was obviously younger. She just died a few years ago. So I came across a picture of her holding up a tunic. Same thing, 3 stars on the collar tab, but only 3 rows of decorations. So I don't know if that's the same tunic. So what I did was an AP reporter who wrote about this woman and wrote about Tojo's great-grandson. I sent her the picture of Jack Wilpers in the tunic, saying, can you get this to one of Tojo's descendants and see, does somebody have this particular tunic? So I'm waiting to hear back. Maybe it's somewhere. I think it'd be neat to find out. Because I don't, we have, there was a guy from Albany who came back with Hitler's top hat. Remember that story? Marty Markowitz or something. I wrote his obituary for the Associated Press. when he died. He literally found Hitler's top hat in his apartment in Munich. So I'd like to find where Tojos Tunic is at Jack Wilpers. Right after that, he wrote a letter home to his mom saying things, things have started quieting down after he made all these headlines. And, going to dinner at this hotel, trying to get a meal. And he wasn't afraid to play the Irish card now and then to get a good meal. He knew a sergeant who was a good cook at the hotel, and he's getting meals there. And he's at this hotel, and he sees this priest, and he recognizes the priest. And the priest is Cardinal Spellman, Archbishop Spellman from New York. He was a prominent Catholic archbishop at that time. And Jack sits down to him, introduces himself. Hey, I'm from New York. Turns out the archbishop knows people from Saratoga. And he mentioned in his letter, and all the last names were Irish, so he knew all the Irish folks from up here. And Jack's talking with the cardinal had been touring the Pacific right up until the war ended, and hobnobbing with generals and admirals. So Jack sees him at this hotel, and they're having dinner, and he says, "Can I do anything for you, sir, Father?" And he says, "You know what? I'd like a second bottle of beer. I had one bottle of beer, but the beer is being rationed because it's still early in the occupation. There's not enough beer for everybody. I'd like to get a second bottle of beer." So Jack goes and works his Saratoga magic and gets a second bottle of beer. Well, doesn't the cardinal write and find out where Jack's mom lives, and doesn't he write a letter back home to Mrs. Wilpers, meeting her son and everything, and doesn't she share that letter with the local papers? They did that back then. News from the front, news from overseas. And what the Archbishop wrote was that Jack Wilpers giving me a second bottle of beer was the greatest exercise of power I've seen in the entire Pacific. So he's hobnobbing with guys that control whole armies and fleets. And the guys he's most impressed with is a 25-year-old Irish American from upstate New York. So, yeah. That's a picture of Jack in Japan with one of his interpreters and a couple of his buddies in his unit. That's his, on the right, that's his cousin from Albany, Johnny. And they got together over there. Johnny was in the Pacific. And at one point, Jack, when they were there, Jack arranged to have Johnny sign some orders that said, "You're assigned to me for 2 weeks." And they just went, tooling around in Japan for however long, doing what 20-something-year-old guys would do. And evidently, when Johnny went to find Jack, Jack was getting his hair cut. And when you get your hair cut, I guess then in Japan, the barbers do some sort of whole ritual. They massage your head, and they just do all this stuff. And Jack is in there. He's sort of nodding off. It feels good. And then he's feeling slaps on the side of his head. And he's like, "Oh, this must be part of the ritual." And then the slaps are getting harder and harder. Finally, he stands up, and there's the barber is cowering in the corner. He looks over, and it's his cousin Johnny slapping him. Welcome to Japan. That's Jack after the war. If you've ever been up to the Victoria Pool in Saratoga, or the golf course, that's looks like the Victoria Pool, the columns, enjoying a drink. So Jack was promoted to captain, returned to the U.S. in '46, and he worked at the War Department at the Pentagon. And he joined the CIA right about when it was formed in 1947. I mentioned Wild Bill Donovan, and the OSS. Well, the OSS was disbanded in, I think, October 1945. The war was barely over. And they decided, we don't need this. Well, then the Cold War starts, and then they realize, we need actually some intelligence on the Russians. So they created the CIA in 1947. A lot of the CIA guys were former OSS guys. And a lot of these agents became directors of the CIA, and Jack got a job with them. And he would have probably known a lot of those OSS guys from the war. He worked in various different capacities at the CIA in Langley, Virginia, and spent nearly 30 years with the agency, retired in 1975. In 1949, actually after the war, he was in Washington going to work and evidently standing in a meeting of one of the rows, one of the avenues, And a car full of women were going by, and they saw him there, and somebody said, why don't we give this guy a ride? And they did. And one of the women in the car was Marion Elizabeth Mayer. She was from Washington, D.C. And they started going out, and they got engaged. She went to college at New Rochelle College down in Westchester when it was an all-women's Catholic school. And she was handed an award at graduation by Cardinal Spellman, 4 years before Jack. There's about 1 billion people in the faith, but I think the Catholic, it's a pretty small world, isn't it? Right? They both had a connection to the Cardinal. They got married in September 1949. Bought a home in Garrett Park, Maryland, outside of Washington, D.C. Had 5 kids. And there's the family, 1960-something, Christmas time. Jack coached Little League, had season tickets to the Washington Redskins, took his kids to the games. His daughter Mary had a home in Maine where they would go up for the summers. Jack would pass through Saratoga, visit his sister, and in August, and go to the racetrack. Loved the racetrack. One year he was at the racetrack during a visit, and somebody said, hey, there's a photographer here you might know that works, at that time was working for the Gazette. And they got talking. It turns out it was George Burns from Yank magazine, the guy that took his picture. They were both at the racetrack one day. Wow. And and in the mid-90s, Jack's sister, who was still running I believe a store down in Saratoga, she knew a reporter from Saratoga who worked for the Post-Star, and told the reporter, oh, my brother's in town, he did a famous thing. This was 1995, around the 50th anniversary of the end of the war. Well, my brother did a famous thing during World War II. He's at the track, why don't you go talk to him? And this reporter did, and Jack did talk to her, but gave no details about what he had done, nothing, said the minimum. And evidently he was ticked off at his sister afterwards. That was 1995. Now, how did I get onto this story? In 1991, or thereabouts, I'm doing a book on Saratoga, old photographs, and I had to talk to people about the old days in Saratoga, the casino days, the old days, and I asked my father, who was a lawyer for 40 years in Saratoga County, who should I talk to? He goes, oh, talk to this old judge and go talk to this old lawyer named Al Brame. Al knows where all the bodies are buried. So I go up to see Al at his office in Saratoga, downtown Saratoga. And he's telling me about the old days, and comes around to World War II, Saratoga was like. I said, oh, I'm interested in World War II stuff. He goes, oh, you might be interested in this. And he gets up, goes to his bookcase, and takes out this, and this is a Xerox copy of that Yank magazine article. And I go, oh, I've seen that picture. He goes, yeah, but that guy in it with the gun, my brother-in-law. I go, really? And I'd seen this picture before. He goes, yeah. He goes, I go, is he still alive? He goes, yeah. You want to talk to him? I go, sure. So he calls his number. And somebody answers, it's not Jack Wilpers. Turns out it's his son, John. And I tell him who I am with the Associated Press. I'd really like to talk to your dad about capturing Tojo. And John laughs. He goes, you know what? I'm a journalist too. He hasn't even told me about it. You won't talk about it. I go, well, okay. Well, I'm not easily deterred. I'll try again. Well, over the next 20 years, I tried a bunch of times. Called him, had his number, left messages, got him on the phone a couple times. No, not interested. Boom, not interested. One of our editors from New York City, an older woman, was asking us about our story ideas, and I told him about this. And she said, you know, he's from that generation that didn't chat on the phone too much. Why don't you write him a letter? He's from that generation that writes letters. So on AP letterhead, I wrote a letter to Jack Wilpers. Told him what, you know, dropped all kinds of names, Saratoga, connections, you know, I'm a local guy. Waited a few weeks and called him and got him on the phone. And he said, you sound like a very gracious young man. I appreciate it, but I am not. I've been offered a lot of money to tell my story. I've got no interest. Click. Okay. So what I would do is every now and then Google him. Google was up around by then. Figuring if I can't write about this guy in life, I'll write his obituary because he did something famous. The Associated Press is always doing obituaries on famous people. I can write his obituary, or somebody in the AP can write his obituary. And that's how I found out his wife had died, Mrs. Wilpers had died. And in her obituary it said her survivors include Jack, her husband of 57 years, Jack Wilpers. So I knew Jack was still around. So in the summer of 2010, in August, and I think it was because the war ending anniversary was coming up, I Googled him again, and doesn't his name pop up? Turns out Jack Wilpers finally got some medals that he was due for years. Never got them. He had written to the Pentagon and said, hey, by the way, I'm supposed to have these medals. Can you get them for me? Well, they put together a ceremony once they realized who he was and what he had done. They put together a ceremony for him at the Pentagon where he got these medals. And it happened in the end of February. I didn't find out until August. So it was in the Washington Post and something called the Military Times. The Associated Press in Washington did not pick up the story, didn't notice it, or didn't care about it. Two things that jumped out at me when I read these stories was, one, it didn't really go into a lot of details on what he actually did that day. It did list the recommendations that he kept Tojo alive, but just wasn't a lot. And also it didn't mention, it said he was from Garrett Park, Maryland. It didn't say that he was a New Yorker. It didn't say that he was born and raised in our part of the world. So I figured, oh, the Albany Times-Union, if I can get this guy to talk, the Albany Times-Union and local papers and radio and TV stations would be interested. And so I mentioned that to my boss. I said, hey, Jack Wilpers, because he knew about my quest to get Jack Wilpers to talk. And my boss was, at that time, living in Saratoga and was a history buff himself. And he goes, and I said, hey, why don't I try this guy? He goes, go ahead, but you know what? You're going on vacation in a couple days. Why don't you wait till you get back? And then if he doesn't want to talk, you know, we're done with him. I go, okay. And that was towards the end of August of 2010. So I go off on vacation, and oh, that's another picture. That's one of Jack's daughters at the ceremony at the Pentagon. And so I go off on vacation. That's his recommendation for the medal he got. How he prevented Tojo from taking his own life. And Jack hadn't done what he'd done. Tojo would have dodged justice. Where I go on vacation with my brother Barry since the late 80s, a place called Westport, Mass. Cape Cod is over there, the Rhode Island line is there. Most of it is public beaches, except for that one corner down there. There's some private houses for rent. That's where my brother and I stay. And in late August of 2010, when we were there, a storm is coming up the coast, working its way up the East Coast with the potential of becoming a hurricane. You know, it's hurricane season. And the owners of the houses there were concerned about our safety and said, oh, why don't you guys leave a day early if that's okay? So instead of leaving on a Saturday, we had to leave on a Friday. Well, that Friday, I wanted to check out the West Beach, which is a little nicer, not as crowded. So I said, oh, I'll do that on Thursday. So on Thursday, I threw a towel, a book, and a hat, and a backpack. And the hat I had was this one of the giveaway hats at Saratoga Racetrack, 2004. I never throw away hats. So I jump on my bike, I ride a couple miles down there, carry the bike over the dunes, lay out my stuff, and start watching the surfers. This isn't a surfing hotspot, but when there's storms coming up, it can kick up some good waves. So all the surfers came out, and they tend to be a younger bunch, except for this one older dude who caught my eye, because he was an older dude, and doing a couple runs, and then he gets done, picks up his board, grabs his stuff, his gear, and he's walking by me, and he's got a hat on. This hat. 2004 racetrack giveaway hat. And I say, hey, nice hat. He looks at me and I said, I'm from Saratoga Springs, how about you? And he says, no, my family lived there years ago, but it's been a long time since any of us have been, lived there. And he started to mention some of the businesses his family owned. And I said, it's a little bit before my time. What's your family's name? And he says, Wilpers. And I say, tell your old man I'm still pissed off at him. He's not talking to me about capturing Tojo. And he kind of looks at me and I said, yeah, I'm that guy from the AP in Albany. I've been trying for 20 years to get your old man to talk. I said, the following Monday is Labor Day. I'm back in the office bright and early Tuesday morning. I'm going to call your father. Please pave the way. So we chatted for a little bit. He said, I'll do that. So we leave the beach. I get back home. Now I'm excited to get back to work for the first, after a week's vacation, I'm never excited to get back to work. But this time I was. And that Tuesday morning, I get in, and the first thing I do is send off an email to John Wilpers, the guy I had met on the beach, who lives in the Boston area and vacations every year with his family in the same town. I said, it was great meeting you. I hope you talked to your father because I'm going to call him. And he got back to me almost immediately in an email. Yes, it was great meeting you too. I've let my father know you're going to call. So I waited to a decent hour that morning, and I called. And Jack Wilpers answered the phone. I told him who I was, identified myself, And he said, you know, it's such a long time ago, I'm 90 now, I don't think I can remember all that. Well, he didn't say no and he didn't hang up. So I knew I had a shot. So I just started asking about questions about growing up in Albany, you know, about his younger days. And that's when I found out he was born in Albany. I didn't know that till that point. Told me about his family, about moving to Saratoga. We moved into his schooling and his military career. So I talked to him about an hour, and then he got into details about capturing Tojo. Now I had this article on my desk, and by then I had gotten some of those AP articles. I had those on my desk, and on my computer screen I had accounts of this. And he would veer off now and then, but pretty much stuck right to that narrative. He remembered everything, because I was checking left and right. He's right on. Oh, yep, he got that right. He took him a while, but he remembered everything about that day. Details that I didn't see anyplace else. So I talked to him about an hour, and I said, you know, as I'm putting this together, I'm going to have more questions. Can I call you back? He said, sure. So the next morning, I called him back, spoke to him again about half an hour, and if I had a football, I would have spiked it, because I finally got this guy. It was like would have been a journalist version of a touchdown dance. So a couple days after that, my story went on AP's national and international wires. And the AP now, I think we're up to 15,000 media outlets. In 2010, I don't know, but we have a lot. So this story finally went out, and that's one example. It's a Boston Globe website. So this story would have been printed, and we just never know how many, but a lot, and overseas. So I finally got Jack Wilpers, finally got him to talk, and finally got him on the record, because he had not talked to anybody about it in the media since that day. As he told me when I was talking to him, I even told my wife and kids about it. Actually, he kind of did when his son Michael was in college in the 70s. Some friend of his said, hey, I just read something in a history book. Your father did something, captured Tojo. So the son came back from college, and the father, and Jack Wilpers said, forget you ever heard about it. And he told me that. But anyway, so the family knew, the kids knew that Dad did something great. But he just didn't really, like a lot of these World War II veterans, just didn't really talk about it. Plus, you know, he was in Army intelligence, then he went into the CIA. They don't talk to anybody. So I kept in touch. I never talked to Jack Wilpers again, never met him face to face, but I kept in touch with his son John, and just would email him now and then, how's your dad doing? And then finally, the winter of 2013, John replied, you know, Dad's health has been going down for a while, he's in assisted living. And I had said to John that, you know, and John knew this as being an ex-reporter, that we do prepared obituaries. The New York Times does them. Because when somebody famous dies, you don't want to write an obituary on the fly. You want to have all the info already stored. So I prepared Jack Wilpers' obit for the AP. And when I got word that he had died, I just, you plug in the age and the day and when it happened. And that story went on AP's national and international wires. So for a second time, I got to tell Jack Wilpers' story twice in 3 years, after he didn't want to talk to anybody about it. Jack died in late February 2013. The New York Times did their own obituary on him, though they actually used some of my information. And his hometown paper, the Washington Post, they used my story initially too. And then a day or two later, talked to some of Jack's children, and they did their own obituary. These are just some of the things Jack said over the years. That letter in 1994 was a response to somebody in Hollywood that wanted to do a movie on his life. And I didn't know at the time when he told me. People offered me a lot of money for my story. That's what he was referring to. And then he wrote the letter to the Pentagon office in charge of military awards. I tried to avoid the insatiable appetite of the media and would prefer to continue to do so. And he did a good job of that. And then he told me, I asked him what it meant. And he goes, in the end, we just all wanted to get home. We were doing our job. And then there's the old boy. Yeah, if you walked in the room right now, you'd love the guy. I mean, he was just smart, funny, well-read, well-educated. Could figure out the odds on a horse race in a second.
I think that's
And before I open the floor, that's the story of Jack Wilpers, the guy that captured Tojo. And before I open it to questions, I want to interview his daughter. He's brought the hat.
Guys in all that trouble.
I gave him a new hat, by the way.
I did.
At the Saratoga one, a newer one.
Brand new.
Yeah.
But of course, it's one of those giveaways, right? He didn't spend any
Oh,
money on it.
yeah, I laid out for that. So, yeah, any questions, folks, for John?
I have a story that follows this up. He was nominated for that Bronze Star, but you saw he only got it in 1990, whatever, not 2000 and whatever it was. It bothered him all the time for most of his life. He was nominated, never knew what happened, raised the family. My mother dies, and he starts to pursue it. He gets mimeographed letters. You're not eligible, you're not eligible, you're not eligible, never saying why. And it was beginning to drive him crazy. I'm a reporter. I took a month. I went down, and I figured the best way to get a hold of somebody, the best way to solve a problem is not to talk to the problem, it's to talk to the problem's boss. So I called the Adjutant General's office in the Pentagon, and I lied. I said, I'm returning Colonel Stevenson's call. He was the guy causing the trouble. Not true at all, but I figured that was my in. And I also know that in the Pentagon, all the phones are staffed by petty officers. And they're not there to argue with you, they're there to make things happen. And so I said, I'd like to talk to the Adjutant General about the man who captured Tojo. And I figured that'll get his attention. So sure enough, they have us come in. I'm carrying that big picture of him with Tojo, and it was one of the most amazing things my dad had happen to him, because everybody came up to him and shook his hand and said, thank you for your service, thank you for your service. We couldn't walk in a straight line. We just had to keep taking these thank yous, thank yous, thank yous. And we got into the Adjutant General's office, and Colonel Stevens is there. He's called up to his boss's office, which was just delightful. And the Adjutant General goes, what the heck's the problem here? And he goes, well, the Bronze Star is a wartime medal, and the war ended 7 days before your dad captured Tojo. I'm sorry. And the Adjutant General's like this, and I thought, I don't know why I thought of it, but I thought, I'll bet that General MacArthur extended the period of eligibility for the Bronze Star because people were still shooting at each other. And that and this clerk, a guy who worked with Colonel Stevens, says, Colonel Wilpers, I'll look. 2 weeks later, we get a call, come down, we found it, sitting literally outside of Colonel Stevens' office in a stack of stuff, yellowed memos tied together with GI bootstrings, those green bootstrings, and in there extended the eligibility of the Bronze Star to April of 1946. And he said, your dad's eligible, get him down here right now. So we got him down there, and the Adjutant General has a medal, and he's talking about it. I thought that was going to be it. Like, okay, good, you got your medal, let's go home. And he goes, no, Colonel Wilpers, you come with me. The rest of the family go into this auditorium, and the Pentagon has a rule that they will never unman the phones. Someone will always get they'll get a person. That day, they said, anybody who wants to go see the man who captured Tojo, the room was packed. And they come into the caissons go rolling along, the Adjutant General gives him his medal, my father is still together enough to make a speech, and it was just, he had that, I was very lucky and I feel very honored to be able to give my dad that moment that had eluded him and that it clearly meant so much to him. And then I called the Post and said, I got a story for you, the story you saw. And every day of his life, my father would go out to the driveway, pick up the Washington Post, go down, read the paper, and this morning I got it. I went down and I gave it to him, and there he was, right there. Better very late than never. Veteran gets his Bronze Star. So before he passed away, he had dementia and so on. But when he got that medal, he knew it. And so he ended the chapter. He was able to end the chapter happily.
And what he told me was about that ceremony. He goes, yeah, all these women lined up to give me a hug and a kiss. I really like that.